In the early morning hours of January 24, 1989, serial killer Theodore Robert Bundy sat in his cell on death row at Florida State Prison in Stark, facing his final hours. The condemned man declined a special last meal, so prison officials served him the standard fare: a medium-rare steak, eggs over easy, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk, and juice. Bundy barely touched the food, his appetite diminished by the gravity of what lay ahead. Outside the prison walls, an unusual scene was unfolding as hundreds of people gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, creating a carnival-like atmosphere with vendors selling T-shirts, buttons, and other souvenirs commemorating the execution. Some held signs with messages like "Burn Bundy Burn" and "Tuesday is Friday." The crowd had come to celebrate the end of a man who had become America's most notorious serial killer. Inside the prison, Bundy spent his final hours meeting with his Methodist spiritual advisor, Fred Lawrence. The two prayed together as Bundy prepared himself for what was to come. Having exhausted all possible appeals, including a last-minute appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court and a plea for clemency to Florida Governor Bob Martinez, Bundy knew his fate was sealed. Governor Martinez had made it clear he would not intervene, stating that for him to be executed for one murder does not serve justice for the many he killed. As the night wore on, Bundy also spoke with James Dobson, the founder of the conservative Christian organization Focus on the Family. In this interview, conducted just hours before his execution, Bundy claimed that pornography had fueled his violent impulses and contributed to his crimes. Many experts would later question the sincerity of these statements, suggesting that Bundy was attempting to shift blame away from himself in his final hours. The execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. Eastern Time. At approximately 6 a.m., guards came to Bundy's cell to prepare him for the walk to the execution chamber. They shaved his head and right leg to ensure proper contact with the electrodes that would deliver the fatal current. Bundy was calm and cooperative during this process, a stark contrast to the defiant and manipulative behavior he had often displayed during his trials. At 6:45 a.m., Bundy was led into the death chamber. Witnesses described him as pale but composed. He was strapped into the oak electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky, which had been in use since 1924. Leather straps secured his chest, arms, and legs, and a metal skull cap electrode was placed on his freshly shaved head. Another electrode was attached to his right leg. A black hood was placed over his head, obscuring his face from the witnesses. 24 witnesses were present in the small room adjacent to the execution chamber, watching through a window. Among them were the prosecutors who had secured Bundy's conviction, several journalists, and prison officials. Conspicuously absent were any representatives from the families of Bundy's victims, as Florida law at that time did not allow for family members to witness executions. Before the electricity was administered, Bundy was asked if he had any last words. According to those present, he said in a hoarse voice, "I'd like to give my love to my family and friends." These would be the final words spoken by the man who had confessed to murdering at least 30 young women across 7 states, though criminologists believe the actual number of victims may be much higher. At 7:06 a.m., the signal was given, and the executioner, hidden behind a partition, pulled the lever that sent 2,000 volts of electricity through Bundy's body. His body stiffened and pressed against the straps as the current flowed through him. After the initial jolt, the voltage was lowered and then raised again, a standard procedure for electrocutions. Smoke rose from Bundy's leg where the electrode was attached. The entire process lasted approximately 2 minutes. At 7:16 a.m., after a physician checked for vital signs, Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. The man who had terrorized women across the United States in the 1970s, who had escaped from custody twice, who had represented himself at his own murder trials with an arrogant confidence, was gone. As news of Bundy's execution spread, the crowd outside the prison erupted in cheers. People set off fireworks, honked car horns, and sang together. Some held signs reading, "Justice is served," and "The score is even." The celebration reflected the deep public anger toward Bundy and a sense of relief that he could never harm anyone again. The execution marked the end of a criminal case that had captivated and horrified the nation for years. Bundy's crimes were not only brutal but also demonstrated a level of calculation and intelligence that challenged the stereotype of the crazed killer. He was handsome, articulate, and educated, having studied psychology and law. He used these qualities to gain the trust of his victims, often pretending to be injured or posing as an authority figure before attacking. Bundy's murderous spree began in the early 1970s, primarily in Washington State, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His victims were mostly young women and girls, many of them college students. After his initial capture in Utah in 1975, he escaped from custody twice, once by jumping from a courthouse window during a recess in his preliminary hearing, and again by sawing a hole in the ceiling of his cell and climbing through it. Following his second escape in December 1977, Bundy made his way to Florida, where he committed his final known murders. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee, brutally attacking 4 women and killing 2 of them, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. He then attacked another woman, Cheryl Thomas, in a nearby house. Just a few weeks later, on February 9, 1978, he kidnapped and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach in Lake City, Florida. Bundy was captured for the final time on February 15, 1978, when a police officer in Pensacola noticed him driving a stolen vehicle. His trials for the Florida murders were media sensations, televised nationally and featuring Bundy's decision to act as his own attorney. He was convicted and sentenced to death for the murders of Bowman and Levy in July 1979, and for the murder of Leach in February 1980. As Bundy's body was removed from the execution chamber, the prison superintendent addressed the waiting journalists. "I believe that justice has been served," he said. "Theodore Bundy has met his maker, and now he faces a higher tribunal than this court." Outside the prison, the celebration continued. Some in the crowd had been there for more than 24 hours, camping out to ensure they didn't miss the moment. Vendors sold the commemorative items, and locals gave interviews to the assembled media. One man told a reporter, "This is a day Florida has been waiting for. This is a day America has been waiting for." Law enforcement officials from multiple states expressed relief at the execution. Many had worked for years to build cases against Bundy, and some had traveled to Florida to witness the end of the man who had eluded them for so long. For them, the execution represented the closing of a chapter in their professional lives that had consumed enormous resources and emotional energy. For the families of Bundy's victims, the execution brought a complex mix of emotions. While many expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, they also acknowledged that Bundy's death could not bring back their loved ones or heal the wounds his crimes had inflicted. Some family members chose not to comment publicly, preferring to process their feelings privately. In the days following the execution, newspapers across the country ran front-page stories about Bundy's death. Television news programs dedicated significant airtime to retrospectives on his crimes, his trials, and the phenomenon of public fascination with serial killers. Criminologists and psychologists offered analyses of Bundy's personality and motivations, attempting to understand how someone could commit such heinous acts. The execution of Ted Bundy marked a significant moment in American criminal justice history. It came at a time when the death penalty was being increasingly challenged on constitutional grounds, and when public debates about its efficacy and morality were common. For supporters of capital punishment, Bundy represented the perfect example of why the death penalty was necessary, a remorseless killer who had committed unspeakable crimes and who posed a continuing threat to society as long as he lived. As the day wore on and the crowds outside the prison began to disperse, the carnival atmosphere gradually faded. The vendors packed up their merchandise, the television crews dismantled their equipment, and the parking lots emptied. By nightfall, the area around Florida State Prison had returned to its usual quiet state. Inside the prison, staff returned to their regular routines, though many would later speak of the unique tension that had permeated the facility in the days leading up to the execution. For them, Bundy had been not just a notorious criminal but also an inmate under their supervision, someone they had observed and interacted with daily. In the years that followed, Ted Bundy would continue to fascinate the public and influence popular culture. Books, documentaries, and films would explore his crimes and psychology. Law enforcement agencies would study his methods to better understand and catch other serial killers. His name would become shorthand for a particular type of predator, the charming, intelligent killer who hides in plain sight. But on that January morning in 1989, as the sun rose over the Florida landscape, what mattered most to those gathered outside the prison was simply that Ted Bundy was dead. The man who had caused so much pain and fear was gone, and to many, that felt like justice. As one witness to the execution later told reporters, there was a sense of finality to it all. After years of trials and appeals and media coverage, it was over. Ted Bundy would never hurt anyone again.